But I did want to bring this up because I think it's totally normal. We were I wouldn't say we were laughing at it, but we were being a little dismissive of the idea that our eyes have a bias towards what Donovan Mitchell does versus Rudy Gobert does. I don't want to disparage any NBA fan whose intuition has that bias. I want to bring it back to the Knicks because I think the Knicks currently, as constructed, are very, very weighed towards emphasizing intuition. And what I mean by that is Tom Thibodeau, for all the criticism he gets about his long shifts and lack of rotations and lack of creativity when it comes to lineups, he also is one of the most anal substitutors or lineup builders in the entire NBA. And what I mean by that is if there is a deficiency that's loud and clashes with something that he believes is paramount to success in the NBA, he's going to build a lineup that checks that box. If you're struggling with size at the point of attack, he's going to play somebody who the macro data says is very impactful. He's going to play them less in favor of a worse basketball player who just happens to check that box. He very much is trying to construct lineups that perfectly deflect and negate a team's deficiencies. Of course, it starts with rim protection and defensive rebounding, but you go across the board and he's always doing those things. And so I want to turn it back to you because I think it's an actually very interesting discussion. The top-down data doesn't care about these things. It's only telling you why. It's not telling you why a guy's effective. It's telling you that he is effective. And I do think that the Knicks would be better off if they stopped caring so much about, they're really struggling with size at the three and just played the best three, and you can do that for a number of positions, a number of roles. I think if the Knicks stopped picking holes in the data and just said, okay, the data is clearly telling us that these lineups and these players are the most effective, we're just going to throw them out there and at least try and at least trust that the data will be reinforced. And if it's not, you adjust from it. But at least you'd have a baseline foundation that's backed in analytics, and it gives you something to deviate from. I want to get your thoughts on that, and I'd love to hear you explain more about the top-down data and just why that's different than a coach or a fan who's watching with his eyes and is like, oh, the Knicks are clearly getting crushed on the glass. We need to add a power forward and a small forward who can help in that specific area.
Yeah, these are great questions. Absolutely. The thing I love is that about when you look at top-down data is that there's so much that happens in the game of basketball that is almost imperceptible to the eye. And data in terms of counting stats or other statistics that we're trying to aggregate or accumulate, it's really hard to account for things that don't happen. It's really hard to account for things that don't happen. And if, let's say someone's defense is, what's the value of a stunt and recover, that causes an offensive player to not do something that he would have done if that player wasn't there, right? It's almost impossible. It's imperceptible. We can't say, what would have happened if, quickly didn't make that stunt and recovery and the player would have had an open driving lane and be able to get all the way to the basket. Honestly, it's just so hard to see, A, whether that is happening or not happening, and B, what would happen in the case were quickly not on the court and someone else was on the court. We can't count those statistics. It's just we're not able to perceive them. Maybe with, different types of technology that, I'm sure the NBA is looking into, that will be something that we could count later on, and we could go with more of a bottom-up approach. And when I say bottom-up, I mean by counting the things that happen and then adding them up into figuring out what's the sum in terms of impact. But right now, the best thing that we have is going top-down, and that's starting from the scoreboard. That's starting by looking at the scoreboard. So as most of us know, plus minus is the point differential that a team has when a player is on the court. And we use this to calculate the team's net rating when the player's on the court by converting it to per 100 possessions. We always talk about this kind of thing. But then we can take it a step further by figuring out the player's on off by comparing the team's net rating with him on the court versus the team's net rating with him off the court. So this is, the on-off rating can tell us how much better or worse the team does when that player is playing. Jeff and I talk about this all the time. Most NBA fans talk about this all the time. But if we talk about, and this is something that we talked about on the KFS live stream that we did recently, the concept of kind of causality, we can't draw any conclusions about causality for these on-off ratings. So for the example I like to use, and I use this all the time, is that at least when the last time I looked, this may not be true, but right now, but it's often true. The number 2 player in on-off in the NBA is Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. And I think he was at like a plus 23.9 on-off, which sounds insane. So that means that the Nuggets are like 24 possessions per every 100, 24 points per every 100 possessions better with KCP on the court than off the court. That's completely ridiculous, astronomical. Does that mean that KCP is the most valuable player in the league? Actually, KCP shares the court with this guy named Nikola Jokic about 90% of the time. 90% of the time they share the court together. And Jokic is on off, which, I'm not sure what the updated is, but last time I looked, it was like plus 24.3. So we know, based on other ways to getting closer to figuring out like causality, that Jokic is probably more responsible for the insane on-off than KCP is, right? So the main issue here is that who you share the court with matters a lot when it comes to like plus minus and on off. And it's not just your teammates like KCP and Jokic, but it's the opponents that you play against. So, if a player is only on the court against, let's say the opponent's like LA Fitness Crew, as GMAC likes to say when at the end of the season when Obi Toppin is out there dropping 45, apparently it's against the opponent's LA Fitness Crew, and he destroys them. It doesn't tell us that he's better or more impactful than Jokic, who might be destroying Anthony Davis, for instance, who obviously we know is like completely decimated the Knicks the other night, despite in the loss. So anyway, my point is just that we need to understand like what randomness or noise that happens. And oftentimes noise will be like luck, like the opponents happen to miss a bunch of threes when a player's on the court. But we want to know if the opponents miss threes because a player is on the court or if they just happen to miss threes. So the way that we do this is like a bunch of data crunching that is probably very boring. But we want to understand like comparisons and relationships amongst the players. And this is where the impact metrics come into play. So the impact metrics, what they try to do is they try to apply a filter that filters out the noisy or like clearly wrong data. And they do something, called using a Bayesian prior, which I won't get into. But it helps identify whether there's like weird outliers and stuff that doesn't make sense. And then it gets rid of them. And then so it's more accurate. And that's what EPM does. So basically the point here is that when you look at this top-down data, it's doing all of these things, again, from the top down. It's starting from the scoreboard, and then it's looking on who's on the court, and then it's trying to understand what is happening when those people are on the court and who is responsible for what is happening with those people on the court. So that is a much better way, in my opinion, to look at impact, because it is accounting for all these intangible things, these imperceptible things that our eye can't pick up, or if it can pick up, it is only through like minute like studying film, looking at it over and over again, which we just can't do with every single play. And there are going to be things that are happening that no matter how much we look at the film, we won't notice. So if we're not able to collect and aggregate each of those data points, we're never going to be able to understand the true value of a player. And that's why top-down data or top-down analysis is often a more useful way to look at, how much impact an NBA player has. I feel like that was probably a little overly complicated, but that's the best way I could think of to talk about it.
Well, no, I think you did a great job. The one thing you didn't mention was roll, which I think gets totally underrated by the average NBA fan. And to your point about, I thought a really great point you made was like, there are all these little things happening on a basketball court all the time that there's no stat for. There's no, so in the biased mind, those things get suppressed. The value or the impact of those things get suppressed. And I think one day we're going to have a more true understanding of how much a point is actually worth. You said it the other week. if a team of G Leaguers stepped foot on the court against the best team in the NBA, they'd still score like 90 points per game. So we have a way to count baskets, but we also probably overrate the impact of individual scoring because most scoring, frankly, is replaceable. If you put NBA players on the court, they're going to score. And I feel like that gets either ignored or discounted. And people in their minds, they're like, those 2 points are worth 2 points. But from an impact perspective, they're actually not.
Yeah, that's a great point because so actually most NBA fans have heard of PER or player efficiency rating. So player efficiency rating is often used and cited as like an impact metric when it is actually the exact opposite. It is a bottom up metric. So player efficiency rating is created by ascribing value to each of the different counting stats that we see on the court. So it says like a point is worth this, a rebound is worth this, an assist is worth this. But like you said, how do we know what the value of that is? Because somebody else would score that same point, or somebody else might get that same rebound, or somebody else might get that same assist. So we don't actually know what the value is of those counting stats. And then we're also leaving out the whole host of other things that happen that, again, are imperceptible that we can't count. So that's why player efficiency rating is so much worse or not as valuable, doesn't have as much predictive value, doesn't have as much descriptive value as something like EPM or LeBron, these other impact metrics. So that's a great point. I just wanted to strike on that.
Yeah, and the last thing you said is so important. Some stats tell you what happened. Some stats tell you a version of what happened, but also have more correlation with what's going to happen in the future. And if there are baseball fans listening to this, you have ERA versus FIP. It's possible to have, and FIP is just like an adjusted ERA, a really good adjusted ERA that, as you know, or maybe you didn't know this, but I'm sure intuitively you did, a pitcher can only control so many things. An ERA isn't telling you where the person pitched, who they pitched against, who their defenders were. There's a lot of luck with hitting a baseball, where the baseballs happen to fall, or what hole, if they happen to find a hole on ground balls. FIP is adjusting for how hard the balls you allow to be hit are given up for. They adjust for opponent, they adjust for field, yada yada. So if you want to look at how good a season, I mean, me and XJ have actually argued about this before, but if you want to look at how good a season a guy's had, it's actually pretty reasonable to look at ERA, because it's possible to be extremely lucky, but just for that stretch of time, have had good results. But if you want to look at how good somebody is likely to be going forward, you want to look at this adjusted data and this more advanced data.
Yeah. I think those are all great points, and I know we kind of diverged away from the Knicks a little bit, but I think this is all extremely relevant to saying when the coach or coaches are looking at players' impact and they're in the lineups, like Geoff said, there's multiple ways you can look at it. One way you can look at it is that there may be these deficiencies. This player's too small, may get exploited in this specific way, or this player's too slow and may get exploited in this specific way. And there's a lot of validity to that, because there's a lot of stuff that, the impact data can't necessarily predict that's happening. Impact data is not nearly 100% accurate. There's a ton of error in that. But at the same time, there's a lot to say with regard to like, here are the outcomes. Here are the outcomes when I throw these guys out there together across a huge sample size. Let's go with that. And then maybe one day we'll look at the film and we'll be able to figure out, oh, okay, it's this synergy that happens. These guys play off of each other this way. There are all these synergistic effects that we can start to notice over time if we look hard enough. But to me, it's like, hey, let's get the impact and then we'll figure out what the why later. And that's generally my perspective.
Well, we've seen when you do it the other way, when you look at lineup construction as feeling out how best to check boxes that you think are important, you could end up doing something like starting Elfrid Payton 71 out of 72 games because you need his size at the point of attack. So look, as as a person who has deep dove into certain aspects of professional gambling, I can promise you that in almost any game or any system that requires a strategy, having a baseline foundation that is optimal that you can then deviate from is much better than operating purely on feel. So that's what you always want to do. You need to, in poker and chess, it's called GTO, game theory optimal. All the elite chess players, all the elite poker players, these people all have a system, and they know what makes them truly special is they have this system, locked down. They have it memorized. They've studied. They know all the moves, but they also have a feel for, okay, I think this is a good time to deviate. I do not see Tom Thibodeau as operating on any sort of optimal like baseline and then, I'm just going to deviate a little bit from here. He is very much flying by the seat of his pants and just, okay, we're playing these guys this week, and I actually think rebounding is going to be the most important thing. So I'm going to go with my best rebounders. I feel very strongly that the Knicks would be better off if they went with a more data-driven lineup construction or rotation construction and gave Tom Thibodeau the freedom. Because, look, I'm saying this, but I want to be very clear. I do trust Tom Thibodeau's basketball mind. I do trust him in certain spots to understand better than most people would, what is required. I think that he has things that only experience can give you. But I think there needs to be a little bit tighter of a leash on what the Knicks baseline is, what they're starting from. If Tom Thibodeau looks at a matchup and says, I'm not sure what Emmanuel Quickley can do here. I think his size is going to be exploited. I'm not going to have the ball in his hands very much. I'd probably still disagree with that. But if the baseline was, okay, Quickley's going to play 30 minutes a night, just sometimes I'm going to fudge that a little bit, I would trust that a lot more, and I think the Knicks would be a lot more successful.